So if you've hung out around Peace Mennonite much, you may have heard us talk about mercy ministry and justice ministry. Mercy ministry being individual acts of compassion that we do, acts of service for individuals, and justice ministry being efforts to change policies and systems in order to benefit the needy and vulnerable in our society. We volunteer with the Emergency Shelter and Family Promise, and we support the Justice Matters Homelessness Research Team. Ken Ratzlaff sings with the East Hills Singers. You can read more about that later in the worship service. And we write letters against the death penalty and fight our local jail expansion. It's easy to think of these mercy and justice ministries as two separate or even competing roles of the church. I mean, some of us are more drawn to mercy ministry, volunteering with service organizations and reaching out to neighbors and to each other with food and flowers and phone calls. Some of us gravitate more towards justice ministry. We push for full inclusion of LGBTQ people in our denomination, and we show up for Justice Matters efforts, or even start working for Justice Matters. We share information on Facebook about justice issues and support political candidates we believe will implement more just policies. And sometimes there can even be tension within churches around these mercy and justice ministries. Mercy people may wonder why more people aren't showing up for Link or making phone calls to check on people. Justice people might question the priorities of those who aren't signing their petitions and coming to their meetings. Or, what I see more of at Peace, is that mercy people feel guilty for the meetings that they don't go to, and justice people feel guilty for not serving at Link often enough. And so it's really interesting to me that here we see that the earliest Christian church apparently struggled with some of these same tensions, right? The church people are busy doing their mercy ministry, taking food to the widows, when a group comes along and says, hey, wait a minute, what about justice? You Hebrews aren't giving our Hellenist widows their fair share of food. At this point, we may take a little digression for some helpful background, right? So at this earliest point in the church, following Jesus is still a movement within the Jewish faith, right? These folks we're reading about, they're not trying to start Christianity. They are trying to be Jewish people who follow the Jewish Messiah named Jesus within the Jewish community. So we need to understand that Hebrews and Hellenists, they're all Jews. Hebrews are Aramaic-speaking Jews from Palestine. That's who Jesus was. That's who the 12 apostles are, and the women who announced the resurrection. The Hebrews are the power center of this new movement. But along the way, maybe you remember Pentecost, right? Along the way, some other Jews have heard about Jesus and decided to follow him. And these Hellenists speak Greek. They're Greek-speaking Jews from other parts of the world. Many of them are descendants of people who were displaced by the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC. Others had left the Jewish enclave of Palestine for their own reasons, living in other parts of the world, adopting more of the dominant Greco-Roman culture. Many of these Hellenists, though, these dispersed Jews, made their way back to Jerusalem eventually. It's a lot like how Mennonites leave Newton to live in far-flung communities with worldly people, only to return in retirement and find a nice apartment at Showalter Villa. Right, so Jerusalem becomes this gathering place for Jewish people, both Hebrew and Hellenistic Jews. But the Hebrews are in charge of the early Jesus movement, and the Hellenist widows are not getting their fair share of the food. It's encouraging to me that when this injustice is brought to the apostles' attention, they work quickly to address it, right? They appoint a group of 7 people to oversee the food distribution to make sure everyone gets their fair share. And looking at this story helps me to understand some important ways that what we consider our mercy ministry and our justice ministry are really connected. First, we see that the church doesn't take this step toward justice in order to live up to some abstract ideal of being a peace and justice church, right? They take the step so that the Hellenist widows have enough food to eat. The justice work has a concrete goal of relieving people's suffering. They do the justice because they love mercy. I think this story also shows us that if we don't consider issues of justice alongside of our service efforts, we might end up doing harm when we intend healing. I mean, I've been thinking about these poor Hellenist widows. When the Hebrew widows receive all the food, not only are the Hellenist widows still hungry, but now they also feel like they're not fully part of their own faith community. The church layers spiritual pain on top of the physical distress. And there's another connection that I see glimmers of here, but mostly thinking about it from my own experience, that it's in serving others often that we realize and come to understand injustice better. When we hear the stories of the people we serve at Link or the guests at Family Promise, that's when we understand how the systems in our society don't work as well for some people as for others. And a final connection between justice and mercy that this story leads me to think about is how doing justice can, in the long run, free up the church's time and energy for other vital forms of mercy and service. The Justice Matters Homelessness Research Team has encouraged our local leaders who have agreed to participate in the Built for Zero movement, which is so exciting. It's over 80 cities and counties committed to ending homelessness, not finding enough volunteers for the homeless shelter, but ending homelessness. Imagine what kind of time and energy are freed up for other acts of service when everyone in our community has a safe place to live. So I do think we want to understand the distinction between mercy ministry and justice ministry so that we can appreciate both and do both. But I also think that the two are connected in really vital ways. They're not competing, they're supporting each other. And that's been true since the very earliest days of the church. So this conflict that we see here in the early church is relevant to us in a vague way, right, of addressing our call to mercy and justice. But it also bumps right up against a major justice issue, a particular issue that we're talking about right now, which is the sin of racism. Now, I want to be clear that this story is not about racism per se, right? The concept of race as we understand it didn't exist in the first century. And for anyone as interested in this topic as I am, I recommend the podcast Seeing White, and particularly episode 2. I'll put the link below. According to Ibram X. Kendi, who's a historian and an author, a Guggenheim Fellow, he argues that race was invented in Portugal in the mid-1400s by the biographer of Prince Henry the Navigator. Fascinating. So, at any rate, this story in Acts is not about racism, but it is about structural prejudice and discrimination. And to understand what this story teaches us about discrimination, you have to know something that I neglected to point out earlier when we were talking about how the church leaders who were Hebrews addressed the complaints of the Hellenists. I did tell you that the leaders chose 7 people to oversee the distribution of food to make sure it was fair. But I didn't remind you of who those 7 people were. Stephen, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas. This might not mean much to you, but for those who study such things, they tell us that these names are all Greek names. It seems that the Hebrew leaders of the church, the people in power, addressed the injustice that was brought to their attention by welcoming Hellenists into new leadership roles in the church. It may seem from this brief story that the Hellenists are given a lesser role, that there's still a hierarchy at play, which may be true to a certain extent. But as we continue in Acts, we will learn that Stephen does not stick to waiting tables. In his role as church leader, he is soon preaching to large crowds and becomes the first martyr of the Christian faith. So those in church leadership do not just take steps to ensure that the food is distributed fairly. They work to more fairly distribute the power as well. If we truly want to address injustice, we have to pay attention to power. And those of us with power have to be willing to share or even give up power. I imagine that this was scary for the early church, and I know it's a frightening prospect for many people today as we have conversations about dismantling systems that have upheld traditional power dynamics for centuries. I imagine it was a scary move for the early church, and I know that it was a vital move. If the Hebrew Jews had not fully welcomed in the Hellenist Jews, how would they ever have come to a point of receiving Gentiles? And if they hadn't included the Gentiles, then how would the movement have spread anywhere beyond Palestine? How many of us would be trying today to follow the way of Jesus in this world if those Hebrews had not welcomed the Hellenists into power? It's because the early church worked toward justice within its movement that we gather today as followers of Jesus, committed to do justice and love mercy in this world. May we, as they were, be guided and empowered by the Holy Spirit in this work. Amen.